Your food is garbage. The words landed in my kitchen like a slap. I stood at my own stove, spatula in hand, watching steam rise from the eggs I'd been scrambling since 6 this morning. Fresh herbs from my garden, toast cut just the way she liked it. My daughter-in-law didn't look up from her phone. Her coffee mug, the blue one that had belonged to my late husband, sat untouched beside the breakfast I'd prepared with care. I spend time cooking because I care about you both. Well, maybe you shouldn't waste the effort. This isn't food, it's garbage. I don't know how David's father ever survived eating like this. The spatula trembled slightly in my grip. Behind me, I heard my son's newspaper rustle, but no words came. No, Mom's cooking is fine. No, that's enough. Just the soft whisper of pages turning, the sound of a man hiding. It's for your own good, she continued, finally looking at me. At your age, you should probably stick to simpler things anyway. I set the spatula down carefully, the way you handle something that might break. My son was 42 years old and couldn't meet his mother's eyes. The word hung in the air like smoke from burnt toast. I knew then my own son had chosen his side. A white envelope on the counter caught my attention. Bank letterhead peeking through grocery store circulars. When had that arrived? The return address showed an account number I didn't recognize. My name was typed across the front in block letters. Something was coming that none of us expected. But that morning wasn't where this story began. It started 3 years ago when my son called to say they needed a place to stay. Just temporarily, he said. Janet had lost her job at the marketing firm, and their apartment lease was up for renewal. 2 weeks, maybe 3, until they got back on their feet. Mom, you have all this space since Dad passed, David had said over the phone. It would really help us out. I looked around my empty house that morning, at the rooms that still echoed with my husband's laughter, and I said yes, because that's what mothers do. We say yes when our children need us, even when something in our chest whispers that we should think twice. They moved in on a Tuesday. Janet brought 17 boxes of clothes for a 2-week stay. She set up her computer in my husband's old study without asking. When I mentioned the study was still arranged just as he'd left it, she smiled and said it would only be temporary. Temporary had become permanent without my permission. The first month, Janet was helpful. She offered to handle my grocery shopping since she was already going out. She noticed I'd been letting mail pile up since my husband died, and volunteered to organize my bills. Small kindnesses that felt like support when I was drowning in widowhood. Let me help with this, Mom, she'd say, taking bank statements from my hands. You shouldn't stress yourself with numbers right now. I was grateful. I was 70 years old and tired of figuring out insurance forms and tax documents alone. When she suggested she could write the checks and I could just sign them, it seemed like the perfect solution. Less work for me, more help from family. But help has a way of becoming control when you're not paying attention. By the second month, Janet had rearranged my kitchen. She moved my coffee mugs to a cabinet I couldn't reach without a step stool. When I asked why, she said it made more sense organizationally. The good china I'd saved for special occasions disappeared into the garage. We're trying to declutter the space, she explained. All this stuff just collects dust anyway. She started answering my phone. Friends who called to check on me were told I was napping or tired or not feeling up to visitors. Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped coming by for our weekly tea. When I asked Janet why, she said Mrs. Patterson had seemed to understand that I needed space to grieve. I hadn't asked for space, I'd asked for company. Every signature felt like signing away a piece of myself. The bank statements stopped coming to the house in month 3. Janet said she'd switched them to online statements to save paper. More environmentally friendly, she explained. When I asked to see them, she said she'd show me later, but later never seemed to come. My checkbook disappeared from the kitchen drawer, where I'd kept it for 15 years. When I mentioned it, Janet produced a new one she'd ordered from the bank. The checks had both our names printed on them. "It's more convenient this way," she said. "In case something happens to you, I can still handle your affairs." Something happening to me. As if my death was not just possible, but expected, planned for. I had become a guest in my own house. The master bedroom was mine in name only. Janet mentioned that my late-night reading light kept David awake through the thin walls. She suggested I might be more comfortable in the smaller guest room down the hall. It was quieter, she said, better for someone my age who needed more rest. I moved my belongings into the room where my grandchildren used to sleep when they visited. My king-size bed was replaced with a twin. My walk-in closet became a single rod along one wall. When I wanted to retrieve photo albums from my old bedroom, Janet said they were cleaning in there, and could I please wait until later? Later stretched into weeks, then months. My house keys disappeared from my purse in month 6. When I asked about them, Janet said she'd noticed I'd been forgetting to lock the door when I went out for walks. For security reasons, she'd had new locks installed and would keep the keys safe. "At your age, Mom, it's easy to get confused about these things," she'd said, patting my arm like I was a child who'd lost her mittens. I wanted to tell her I'd been locking doors since before she was born, but the words stuck in my throat like old bread, dry and impossible to swallow. The final piece came on a Thursday in November. Janet sat me down at my own kitchen table with papers spread between us like a feast I hadn't ordered. "A power of attorney document," she explained, "just a formality to make managing my finances easier. With David working so much overtime and me handling all the household bills anyway, this just makes it official," she said. "It's what most families do these days." The notary had already been called. A woman named Linda Chen, who arrived at exactly 2 o'clock with her official stamp and witness signatures. Janet had thought of everything. I read through the document slowly, the way my husband had taught me to read contracts. Most of it was legal language that twisted around itself like ivy on a fence. But one thing caught my attention. The notary date was wrong. The document was dated 3 days in the future. "This date is wrong," I said, pointing to the line. "Oh, that's normal," Linda the notary said quickly. "Sometimes we predate documents to account for processing time. But I'd been married to an accountant for 45 years. I knew what document dating meant, and I knew that predating legal documents wasn't normal at all. Something about that signature didn't look right. But questions about documents and dates became the least of my worries when Janet started talking about my memory. It began as casual observations. Little comments dropped into conversations like seeds in garden soil. "Mom, you mentioned Mrs. Patterson twice in the same conversation yesterday. You put the milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator again. I found your reading glasses in the bathroom. Are you sure you're feeling all right?" Each observation was delivered with concern, wrapped in the tone you might use with a child who's skinned her knee. But I remembered our conversation about Mrs. Patterson perfectly. I'd mentioned her once when Janet asked who used to visit for tea. The milk had been placed in the pantry because David had reorganized the refrigerator and I couldn't find space for it. My reading glasses had been in the bathroom because I'd been reading the ingredient list on my new medication, but explanations I learned were just more evidence of confusion. The conversation that changed everything happened on a gray Tuesday in January. I was in my small bedroom, folding laundry that Janet had brought up from the basement, when I heard her talking on the phone in the kitchen below. Her voice carried through the thin floor with the clarity of someone who thought she was alone in the house. "She's getting worse, David. Yesterday, I found her trying to cook dinner at 2 in the afternoon. She insisted it was 6 o'clock. My hands stopped moving over the towel I'd been folding. I had indeed started cooking at 2 o'clock. Because Janet had mentioned the night before that she and David would be home early from work and might want an early dinner, I'd been trying to be helpful. I think we need to consider our options here. She can't live independently much longer. There are some very nice places that specialize in memory care. I've been looking at a place called Sunset Manor. Memory care. The house felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved closer while I wasn't looking. I know it's hard to think about, but we have to be realistic. She signed over power of attorney for a reason. She knew this day would come. I set the towel down carefully and moved closer to the floor vent where her voice was clearest. My heart was beating so hard, I was afraid she might hear it through the floorboards. "The evaluation is scheduled for Friday at 10. Dr. Morrison said it's just a formality, but we need the documentation to move forward. I'll handle everything. Evaluation, Friday at 10. Dr. Morrison." I backed away from the vent on silent feet, my mind spinning with the weight of what I'd just heard. They weren't just talking about my future. They were planning it, without me. The word evaluation felt like a death sentence. That afternoon, I called my bank. I'd been putting it off for months, telling myself that Janet's management of my finances was actually helpful, that I was overreacting to small discrepancies. But something about overhearing that phone conversation lit a fire under my uncertainty. I waited until both Janet and David left for work, then dialed the customer service number from memory, the same number I'd been calling for 20 years. "This is Margaret Chen," I said to the representative. "I'd like to review my account activity for the past 6 months. There was a pause, the sound of typing, then another pause that lasted too long. "Mrs. Chen, I see here that we've been working with your daughter-in-law on your accounts. Let me transfer you to someone who can better assist you. Daughter-in-law, not daughter." The distinction mattered, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The next voice belonged to a woman named Carol, and her tone had the careful neutrality of someone trained not to panic you. "Mrs. Chen, I'm showing some recent changes to your account that you might want to review. There have been several large transfers to external accounts, and your savings balance has decreased significantly over the past 3 months. "How significantly?" "From $47,000 in October to just over $8,000 as of yesterday." The phone felt heavy in my hand. $47,000. My emergency fund, my travel money, my small inheritance from my sister's estate, gone. Where did the money go? The transfers show as going to an account under the name Janet Louise Chen. The transaction descriptions list them as family support and household expenses. Janet Louise Chen. My daughter-in-law's maiden name was Morrison. She'd never legally changed it to Chen after marrying David. Said it was easier to keep her professional identity separate. That didn't make sense, and that's when I understood. Someone wanted the paper trail to look normal. Her voice had that careful tone reserved for victims. "Mrs. Chen, given the amounts involved, I need to ask, are you aware of these transfers? Did you authorize them?" I sat in my small bedroom, surrounded by someone else's furniture, holding a phone, in a house where I was no longer allowed to have keys, and realized that the answer to her question was more complicated than yes or no. "I'm not sure," I said finally. "Mrs. Chen, if you're experiencing any kind of financial coercion, or if someone is accessing your accounts without your knowledge, we have resources to help. I can put a hold on any future transfers while we investigate. Coercion. The words sat on my tongue like medicine, bitter but necessary. What would that involve? We'd need you to come in person with identification to verify your identity and sign some paperwork. Given the amounts involved, we might also need to file a report with our fraud prevention department. Fraud prevention, another bitter medicine word. Can I think about it? Of course. But Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that these patterns, large transfers, account access changes, family members handling finances, these are things we're trained to watch for. If you need help, we're here. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my small room, processing what I'd learned. $39,000 gone. An account in Janet's maiden name. An evaluation scheduled for Friday that I wasn't supposed to know about. A fraud prevention department that was trained to watch for exactly what was happening to me. That evening at dinner, I decided to test something. I mentioned that I'd been thinking about calling the bank to check on my account balance. "Oh, Mom," Janet said without looking up from her plate. "I talked to them just last week. Everything's fine. I'd still like to call them myself. You know how confused those phone calls can make you? Let me handle it. It's easier that way." David kept eating his soup, the spoon hitting the bowl with small, regular clinks. When I looked directly at him, he finally spoke. "Mom, Janet's been managing all this stuff for months now. Why are you suddenly questioning everything? Questioning everything?" As if wanting to know about my own money was somehow unreasonable. Maybe I'm not as confused as everyone seems to think I am. "Mom," Janet said, her voice taking on that patient, concerned tone again. "We're just trying to help you. Sometimes when people get to a certain age, they can become paranoid about family members trying to help them. It's actually very common. Paranoid, common, more bitter medicine words. I'm 73, not 93, and I'm not paranoid." "Of course you're not," David said quickly. "But you have been more forgetful lately. We're just worried about you." I looked across the table at my son, this man who had once brought me dandelions from the yard because he thought they were as pretty as roses, and saw a stranger wearing his face. My own son had become a stranger. The next morning, I told Janet I was going to the library. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did need books. But what I really needed was a phone that no one else could monitor, and a place where I could think without feeling like the walls had ears. The Westfield Public Library sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, the same brick building where I'd taken David for story time when he was 4 years old. The same building where I'd researched colleges for him when he was 18. Now I was researching how to protect myself from him. I found a quiet table in the reference section and pulled out the small address book I kept in my purse. My husband's attorney, Thomas Brennan, had handled our wills and estate planning for 23 years. When Harold died, Mr. Brennan had been the one to explain the trust provisions, the one who'd made sure everything was properly structured for my protection. The phone booth by the library's entrance felt like a relic from another time, but it served my purpose. I fed quarters into the slot and dialed the number I'd memorized years ago. "Brennan and Associates," a voice answered. "This is Margaret Chen. I need to speak with Mr. Brennan about my late husband's trust. One moment, please." The hold music was something classical, probably Mozart. Harold had loved Mozart. I wondered if he would have seen this coming, if he would have understood what his son was becoming long before I did. "Margaret," Tom Brennan's voice was warm with recognition. "I'm so sorry to hear from you under what I imagine are difficult circumstances. What can I do to help?" I had practiced this conversation in my head during the walk to the library, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt clumsy and uncertain. Mr. Brennan, I think someone has been accessing my accounts without proper authorization. Someone in my family. There was a pause, the kind that meant he was choosing his words carefully. Can you be more specific about what you've discovered? Large transfers. $39,000 moved to an account I didn't know existed. My son's wife has been handling my finances, and now she's talking about having me evaluate it for memory problems. They want to move me to a nursing home. Margaret, he said, his voice taking on a different quality, more focused, more attorney-like. Are you somewhere safe where we can talk freely? I'm at the public library. Good. Now tell me about this power of attorney situation. Do you remember signing any documents recently? Yes, but there was something wrong with the notary date. It was dated 3 days in the future. That's a red flag, Margaret, a significant one. Now, I need you to listen to me carefully. Your husband was very specific about the trust provisions he put in place. You are the primary trustee, and you have certain powers that cannot be overridden by any power of attorney document. The phone felt lighter in my hand suddenly, as if his words had given it weightlessness. What kind of powers? The power to revoke any financial arrangements that you feel are not in your best interest. The power to change beneficiaries. Most importantly, Harold built in a clause that required independent review if anyone claimed you were incapacitated. He was very specific about protecting you from that kind of manipulation. Harold had seen this coming. Somehow 23 years ago, my husband had looked into the future and built me protections I was only now discovering. He said the word trustee like it was a weapon. Mr. Brennan, what would I need to do to exercise these powers? First, we need to document everything, every transfer, every document you've signed, every conversation about your mental capacity. Second, we need to act quickly. If they're planning an incapacity evaluation, we need to get ahead of that. Third, we need to protect your remaining assets immediately. How quickly can this be done? If we move fast, we can start protections immediately, today if we have to. Bank holds can happen within hours, and we can file the legal paperwork first thing Monday. But Margaret, I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared for the family conflict this will create? I thought about Janet's face when she called my cooking garbage. I thought about my son's silence, his newspaper rustling, while his wife humiliated his mother. I thought about being moved to a guest bedroom in my own house, about keys disappearing from my purse, about watching $39,000 vanish into accounts I never authorized. Mr. Brennan, I've been living in family conflict for 3 years. I just didn't know that's what it was called. Then let's get to work. Can you come to my office tomorrow afternoon? And Margaret, don't mention this conversation to anyone, not yet. That evening, I waited until both Janet and David were asleep before I retrieved the box of financial documents from my bedroom closet. They'd moved it there when they reorganized the study, claiming it would be safer in my room. What they'd actually done was put it somewhere they thought I'd never look. But when I reached behind my winter coat for a sweater, I felt the cardboard corner poking out, and I realized they hadn't hidden it as well as they thought. The box contained 3 years of bank statements that I hadn't seen since Janet started managing my accounts. I spread them out on my small bedroom floor, like pieces of a puzzle, looking for the pattern that would tell me the full story of what had been taken. The progression was methodical and damning. It started small, a few $100s here and there, always with reasonable explanations. Doctor visits, household repairs, grocery bills that somehow required $600 a week, with the receipts always missing. By month 6, the transfers had grown larger and more frequent. $1,000 for emergency home repairs that I'd never seen evidence of. $1,500 for medical expenses that no doctor had ever billed me for. But it was the timing that told the real story. The largest transfers had happened during the weeks when Janet claimed I'd been most confused, when she'd been pushing hardest for me to sign additional paperwork, when she'd been most insistent that I shouldn't worry about complicated financial matters. The numbers told a story of systematic theft. The most recent statements showed a pattern that made my hands shake with anger. Regular transfers of $2,000, always on the first Friday of each month, always described as living assistance for family care. 4 months of payments to Janet Louise Chen, $8,000 beyond the $39,000 I'd already discovered. Janet had been paying herself a salary for the privilege of stealing from me. I gathered all the statements and tucked them into a folder that I hid behind my winter clothes. Tomorrow I would take them to Mr. Brennan. Tomorrow I would learn exactly how much legal ammunition my late husband had left me. But tonight I sat in my small room surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so methodical it took my breath away, and felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning, but the steady hope of someone who had just realized she had been standing in shallow water all along. The hope of someone who had just discovered that the people who thought they had all the power had forgotten to check who actually owned the land they were standing on. Harold had left me more than money. He had left me options. Tomorrow, I would learn how to use them. He told me justice often looks like paperwork, done correctly. Thursday morning, I told Janet I was going to visit my friend Martha for a few days. Martha Patterson, the neighbor she'd systematically isolated me from over the past 2 years. The same Martha who'd been calling to check on me, only to be told I was too tired for visitors. "I think it would be nice to catch up," I said over breakfast, keeping my voice light. "She's been asking me to stay over since her hip surgery, help her with groceries and such." Janet looked up from her phone, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face, annoyance maybe, or calculation. "Mom, are you sure that's a good idea? You know how you get confused in unfamiliar places? What if something happens?" "I'll be fine. It's just Martha's house. I've been there 100 times. But what about your evaluation tomorrow? Dr. Morrison is expecting you at 10. My evaluation. The one she'd scheduled without telling me. The one I'd learned about by listening through the floor vents, like a spy in my own home. I must have forgotten. What kind of evaluation? Just a routine checkup. Nothing to worry about. But you really should be here for it. I buttered my toast slowly, buying myself time to think. This was the moment everything hinged on. If I stayed, I'd be walking into their trap. If I left, I'd be set in mine. I'm sure Dr. Morrison will understand if we need to reschedule. Martha really needs the help. David finally looked up from his newspaper. "Mom, maybe Janet's right. It might be better if you stayed close to home until after your appointment. Close to home, close to their supervision, close to their control." "I've already promised Martha. I'll call Dr. Morrison myself and explain." I packed a small bag with the same care I'd once used to pack David's lunch for school field trips. Essential items, nothing that would suggest I was fleeing. The folder of bank statements went into the bottom of my overnight case, hidden beneath my extra medications. The copied trust documents fit easily into my purse. They thought I was just visiting Martha. Martha Patterson had been my neighbor for 15 years. She'd watched David grow up, attended Harold's funeral, brought me casseroles during the worst months of my grief. When I called her Wednesday night and explained what I needed, she didn't ask questions, she just said to come over as soon as I could. "Margaret," she said when she opened her door Thursday afternoon, "you look tired, honey. How long has this been going on?" 3 years, but I'm fixing it now. Martha's guest room faced away from my house, which meant I couldn't see Janet's car in my driveway or track their movements. But it also meant they couldn't see me watching from Martha's kitchen window when Mr. Brennan's car pulled into my driveway at exactly 3 o'clock Thursday afternoon. From my position at Martha's table, I called the bank customer service line for the third time in 2 days. This time, I had Mr. Brennan's authorization letter and a list of specific account numbers to reference. Mrs. Chen, this is Carol again. I have those details we discussed. Go ahead. I've initiated a temporary hold on all external transfers from your primary accounts, effective immediately. Any attempts to move money will require your physical presence and dual verification. I've also flagged all previous transfers to the Janet Louise Chen account for review by our fraud prevention team. I watched through Martha's window as Mr. Brennan knocked on my front door. Janet answered, still in her workout clothes. Even from this distance, I could see her posture change when he introduced himself. What does that mean exactly? I asked Carol. It means any money that was transferred without proper authorization will need to be justified with documentation. If the transferee can't provide adequate proof of authorization, the bank will escalate to fraud investigations and may be able to attempt recovery of the funds. We're talking about $47,000, Mrs. Chen. That's a significant amount. Every stolen dollar would have to be accounted for. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem possible. Mr. Brennan had called Martha's house at 8 o'clock to confirm that he'd filed all the paperwork, sent all the necessary notifications, and informed all the proper authorities. Margaret, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd spent 40 years using the law to protect people like me. Everything is in motion. The process server will arrive at your house at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. Are you prepared for what happens next? I've been preparing for 3 years. I just didn't know it. Good. Now, Mr. Brennan told me the documents being served include several different types of legal notices. Some were formal notifications about trust enforcement and the challenge to the power of attorney based on the notary irregularities. Others were demand letters requiring documentation for all financial transactions. Your daughter-in-law will have 48 hours to respond with proof that every transfer was properly authorized. I sat in Martha's kitchen, drinking coffee that was too hot. I didn't mind. It kept my hands busy while I watched the clock move toward 2 o'clock. At 9:30, I saw Janet's car leave my driveway, probably heading to my evaluation appointment, the one she'd scheduled without telling me. I'd called Dr. Morrison's office from Martha's phone an hour earlier. The receptionist confirmed what I'd suspected. No appointment had been scheduled under my name. Janet had apparently made the arrangement through some other means, perhaps claiming it was an emergency consultation. Either way, Dr. Morrison would be very confused when she showed up. At 1:45, I watched a gray sedan pull up to my house. A woman in a business suit got out, carrying a leather portfolio. She walked to my front door with the purposeful stride of someone who dealt with legal documents for a living. Margaret, Martha said, bringing me a fresh cup of coffee. You don't have to watch this if it's too hard. I do have to watch it. I've been waiting 3 years to see what justice looks like. At exactly 2 o'clock, the woman rang my doorbell. I heard it from Martha's kitchen, the same chime that had welcomed friends and family for 20 years. Today, it was announcing the end of everything Janet thought she controlled. The doorbell would ring at exactly 2 o'clock. Janet answered the door in a yellow sundress, the one she'd bought with my money from the account I wasn't supposed to know about. Her smile was bright and welcoming, the expression of someone who assumed visitors were always good news. I watched the process server introduce herself, watched her hand Janet the manila envelope, watched Janet's face change as she read the return address. Even from Martha's window, I could see the moment Janet realized that her careful plans had just collided with the law. Janet's face went through a series of changes that I would remember for the rest of my life. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic. She called for David, her voice carrying across the street, with the sharp edge of someone who'd just realized she was in serious trouble. David appeared in the doorway, still holding what looked like a sandwich. The process server spoke to both of them for several minutes, pointing to specific sections of the documents. I watched my son's shoulders sag as he read whatever was written on those pages. "Mrs. Chen," Mr. Brennan's voice came through the phone I was holding. "I just received confirmation from the process server. All documents have been delivered successfully. Your daughter-in-law and son now have formal notice of the trust enforcement action, the bank fraud investigation, and the requirement to provide documentation for all financial transactions. What happens now? Now we wait. They have 48 hours to respond with proof that every transfer was properly authorized. It's a deadline we set in the demand letter before we petition the court for emergency relief. If they can't provide that proof, and based on what you've shown me, they can't, then we move to the next phase, which is recovery of assets, potential criminal charges depending on what the bank investigation reveals, and restoration of your full control over your finances and property." I watched Janet pace back and forth in my living room, her phone pressed to her ear. David sat on my couch, the legal documents spread across my coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. "Mr. Brennan, what if they try to claim I'm incompetent? What if they push forward with the mental health evaluation?" "Margaret, that's exactly why Harold built in the independent review clause. Any claims about your mental capacity now have to be evaluated by a court-appointed neutral party, not a doctor they choose. And given that you've just demonstrated the ability to discover financial fraud, document it properly, and pursue legal remedies through appropriate channels, I think any competent evaluator will find you quite capable of managing your own affairs. Either they'd cooperate or face court immediately." Saturday morning, I returned home. I didn't announce it. I didn't call ahead. I simply walked through my own front door at 8:30 in the morning, carrying my overnight bag and the folder of evidence that would change everything. Janet was in the kitchen, still in her bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. David sat at my table, surrounded by legal documents spread across the surface like battlefield maps. When they heard my key in the lock, both of their heads snapped up with the startled alertness of people who'd been caught. "Mom," David said, his voice carrying a note of relief that sounded forced, "we were worried about you. We tried calling Martha's house. I'm sure you did. I set my bag down by the door and looked around my kitchen. The same kitchen where Janet had called my cooking garbage 3 days ago. The same table where I'd signed documents I didn't understand. Everything looked exactly the same, but the balance of power had shifted so completely that the air itself felt different. "Mom, we need to talk," Janet said, her voice missing its usual edge of authority. "There's been a misunderstanding." "I'm sure there has been." I pulled out one of the chairs at my own table and sat down. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't ask permission to sit in my own kitchen. "These papers," David said, holding up the legal documents. "They're saying you think we stole money from you. Mom, how could you believe something like that?" I opened my folder and placed the bank statements on the table, arranging them in chronological order with the care of someone laying evidence before a jury. 3 years of transfers. $47,000 moved to accounts I'd never authorized. Monthly payments to Janet Louise Chen. a name that didn't match what she'd told everyone because she'd never legally changed it. "I don't think you stole money from me," I said quietly. "I know you did. The numbers are all here." Janet's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "Mom, you signed the power of attorney. You asked me to help with your finances because you were getting confused. Show me where I asked you to pay yourself $2,000 a month for 3 years. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of our old refrigerator humming. David picked up the bank statements, his eyes moving across the numbers with the growing recognition of someone seeing the truth for the first time. "So, Janet," he said slowly, his voice changing. "What is this? This account? Janet Louise Chen. You told me you'd changed your name." "I was going to. It's just paperwork. It doesn't mean anything. It means you opened an account using my family's name to make theft look like a family arrangement. It means you've been systematic about this for 3 years." The numbers didn't lie, even if she had. David set the statements down and looked at his wife as if he was seeing her for the first time. Then he looked at me with an expression I remembered from his childhood, when he'd been caught in a lie and knew there was no way out except the truth. "Mom, I didn't know about most of this. I swear I didn't know. You knew enough. You knew enough to stay silent when she called my cooking garbage. You knew enough to support her when she wanted to move me to a smaller bedroom. You knew enough to let her isolate me from my friends and take my keys and make me feel like a guest in my own house." The words came out steady and calm, but each one carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated hurt. "You're right," he said finally. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Janet stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "This is ridiculous. David, your mother is confused. She's been confused for months. That's why we scheduled the evaluation, to get her the help she needs." "What evaluation?" I asked. "The one with Dr. Morrison, yesterday at 10. I called Dr. Morrison's office. There was no appointment scheduled. There never was an appointment scheduled. You were planning to show up and claim I was confused, weren't you? Make it look like I was so disoriented that I'd missed an appointment I never actually had." Janet's face went through the same progression I'd watched from Martha's window when the process server had arrived. Confusion, then calculation, then something that looked like panic. "I was trying to help you. Everything I did was to help you." "Help me what? Help me disappear? Help me become so small and manageable that you could take everything I had and convince my own son it was for my own good." I stood up from my chair and faced my daughter-in-law across the table where we'd shared 3 years of meals, where she'd criticized my cooking, managed my money, and planned my future without asking my opinion. "Janet, you have 48 hours to return every dollar you've taken from me. Every transfer, every monthly payment, every grocery bill that mysteriously cost $600 a week. All of it." "That's impossible. Most of it's been spent. We needed it for living expenses." "Then you'll need to figure out how to get it back. Sell whatever you bought with my money. Take out loans. Ask your family for help. I don't care how you do it, but you'll do it. And if we can't, then my attorney will refer this to the authorities for elder financial abuse, and the bank's fraud report will follow. You'll explain to a judge why you used my husband's name to steal from his widow." Janet's face had gone completely pale now, the color of someone who'd just realized that all their careful plans had crumbled into dust. "David," she turned to my son desperately, "you can't let her do this to us, to your own family." "Janet," David said quietly, still staring at the bank statements, "we did do this, to her, to my mother. We were taking care of her. We were stealing from her." The kitchen fell silent again. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson in her yard, watering her roses. Mr. Williams from across the street was getting his mail. Normal Saturday morning activities in a neighborhood where people had been watching this house for 3 years, wondering what was happening to the widow who used to be so social and had gradually become so isolated. "There's something else," I said. "You have 1 week to find somewhere else to live. 1 week to leave voluntarily before the formal notice runs its course." "What?" "This is my house. It was my house when you moved in temporarily 3 years ago, and it's my house now. I'm taking back my keys, my bedroom, my study, and my privacy. You'll find other accommodations." "You can't do that. We have tenant rights." "You can argue tenant rights with my attorney and the court." "I'm done arguing in my kitchen." Janet looked around the kitchen as if she was seeing it for the first time, or maybe seeing it for the last time. The kitchen she'd rearranged, the house she'd controlled, the life she'd planned to manage until it was no longer convenient for her to manage it. "I need to call my lawyer," she said finally. "You do that. Have him call my lawyer. Mr. Thomas Brennan at Brennan & Associates. I'm sure they'll have a very productive conversation about elder financial abuse and fraudulent power of attorney documents with incorrect notary dates." I watched Janet realize that I knew about everything. The money, the evaluation, the documents, the dates, all of it. Begging looked different when it wasn't me doing it. She tried one more time. "Mom, please. We can work this out. We're family." "No," I said, looking directly at her. "Family doesn't steal from each other and call it help." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I picked up my bank statements and put them back in the folder. "You have 48 hours to respond to the legal documents, with proof that every transfer was authorized. You have 1 week to find new living arrangements. You have the rest of your life to explain to David how you convinced him to betray his own mother." I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the morning air flow into the house. Outside, I could see 3 of my neighbors had found reasons to be in their front yards. Mrs. Patterson was watering roses that probably didn't need water. Mr. Williams was checking mail that had already been checked. They'd seen Mr. Brennan's car yesterday, heard Janet's raised voice just now through the open windows. "Janet," I said, my voice carrying clearly enough for anyone within 50 feet to hear. "I'll be expecting those keys by tomorrow morning. All of them." Word travels fast when someone finally speaks loud enough to be heard. The moving trucks arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 days after our kitchen confrontation. I watched from my living room window as 2 men carried Janet's 17 boxes down my front steps. The same boxes she'd brought for a 2-week stay 3 years ago. David supervised the loading, checking items off a list in his careful engineer's handwriting. Janet sat in their rental car, speaking rapidly into her phone. Even through the closed windows, I could see the sharp gestures of someone explaining a situation that had gotten completely out of control. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this. I felt relief, like finally removing a splinter that had been working deeper under the skin for years. The men carried out the computer that had taken over Harold's study. They dismantled the bed that had replaced my king-size mattress in the master bedroom. They loaded the kitchen appliances Janet had insisted were improvements, but had made my morning coffee routine feel foreign in my own house. Moving trucks looked different from my front window when they're there to give you your life back. When they carried out the large mirror Janet had hung in the hallway, the one that had replaced my family photos, I saw David glance up at my window. For a moment, our eyes met across the distance. He raised his hand in a small wave, uncertain and apologetic. I nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was acknowledgement that we still had work to do. The locksmith arrived an hour after the moving truck left. Eddie Martinez had been changing locks in this neighborhood for 15 years. "Mrs. Chen," he said, examining the current locks, "these are good quality, but if you want complete peace of mind, I'd recommend upgrading to something with a security code as well as keys." Smart lock system. You can change the codes remotely if needed, and you'll have a record of when anyone enters or leaves. I didn't love needing it, but I loved what it meant. While Eddie worked, I began reclaiming my house room by room. I started with Harold's study, where Janet's desk had occupied the corner for 3 years. The room smelled like her perfume and printer ink. I opened the windows wide, letting winter air flow through the space, carrying away the scent of someone else's ambitions. Harold's chair was still there, pushed into the closet. I pulled it out and wiped away 3 years of dust. The leather was still soft, still worn smooth where his hands had rested. I sat down and looked around the room, from his perspective for the first time since he died. From this chair, Harold had managed our finances, planned our retirement, drafted the trust documents that had ultimately saved me. He'd been protecting me even then, anticipating threats I couldn't have imagined. I moved back into the master bedroom that evening. My king-size bed was gone. I never found out where it went. I made do with the twin bed from the guest room temporarily, but I was sleeping in my own room again, with my own windows, my own view of the garden Harold and I had planted together. The silence was different here. Not the silence of being alone, but the silence of being home. 2 days later, David called. Not Janet, not both of them together, just David. "Mom," he said, his voice careful and formal, "I wanted you to know that we've moved into Janet's sister's place temporarily, and we've started the process of paying back the money. All of it? We're working on it. Janet's selling some jewelry, and I'm taking out a loan against my 401k. It won't be immediate, but it will happen." Good. That was the first time in years I heard him say a hard thing without looking for an escape. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, probably trying to figure out how to navigate this new relationship where his mother was no longer someone he could manage or dismiss. "Mom, I want to apologize again, not just for the money, but for letting you become a stranger in your own house. For not standing up when I should have. For choosing the easy path instead of the right one. I know you do. Is there a way forward from here? For us, I mean. I don't expect it to be the same, but I hope there's something." I looked out my kitchen window at the garden where Harold and I had spent 20 years growing tomatoes and roses. Some relationships, like some plants, can survive harsh seasons if their roots are strong enough. Others need to be replanted entirely. "David, there are conditions." "Okay." "No surprise visits. You call first and you respect my schedule. No discussing my finances unless I bring it up. No bringing Janet here unless I specifically invite her. And no trying to manage my life because you think you know what's best for me. Those are fair conditions. And David, if you ever see me being mistreated or taken advantage of again by anyone, you speak up immediately. No more choosing the easy path. I will, I promise. Then we can try, slowly." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that tasted exactly the way I remembered it should taste. I picked up the phone and dialed Martha Patterson's number. "Martha, it's Margaret. I was wondering if you'd like to come over for tea this afternoon." 3 hours later, Martha sat at my kitchen table, exactly where she'd always belonged. We talked about her hip surgery, my recent legal adventures, and the relief of finally being able to speak freely in my own house. "You know, Margaret," she said over her second cup of Earl Grey, "I've been watching that house of yours for 3 years, worried about you. We all were. We knew something wasn't right, but we didn't know how to help without making things worse for you. I didn't know that. When people isolate you, they count on your neighbors being too polite to interfere. But neighbors notice things. I thought about the community I'd lived in for 20 years. The people who'd watched my house with concern while I'd felt completely alone inside it. "Well," I said, refilling Martha's cup and then my own, "I'm back now." "Yes, you are, and it's good to see you home." I set the kettle back on the stove. This time it was my stove. 4 months later, I woke up in my own bedroom to the sound of rain against my own windows. The twin bed had been replaced with a comfortable queen-size mattress that I'd chosen myself from a store where I'd paid with my own debit card, using money that belonged only to me. My morning routine had returned to what it was meant to be. I made coffee in my kitchen without asking permission or checking to see if someone else had opinions about the strength of the brew. I scrambled eggs the way I'd always scrambled them, with a pinch of paprika and fresh chives from the herb garden I'd replanted in early spring. The kitchen table was set for one. One plate, one cup, one set of silverware arranged exactly where I wanted them. No accommodating someone else's preferences about place settings or breakfast timing. No walking on eggshells around someone who might find fault with the way I buttered my toast. I ate slowly, reading the newspaper I'd subscribed to again, after 3 years of having someone else decide what news I should or shouldn't see. The crossword puzzle was half finished from yesterday. I picked up my pen and continued working on it, taking as long as I wanted without anyone suggesting that puzzles were a waste of time for someone in my age. Outside my kitchen window, Martha Patterson was hanging laundry on her line. She'd taken to doing this on Tuesday mornings, and I'd taken to having my second cup of coffee at exactly the right time to wave to her across the fence. Small rituals of neighborliness that I'd forgotten I'd missed. The house felt different now, not just because Janet's furniture was gone, or because the locks had been changed, or because my family photos were back on the hallway walls where they belonged. It felt different because it was inhabited by someone who belonged in it. David called every Sunday at 2 o'clock. He'd been consistent about this for 12 weeks now, always checking first if it was a good time to talk, always asking about my week without trying to manage it. We were learning how to be family again, but slowly, carefully, with boundaries that we both understood and respected. Janet's restitution checks had arrived monthly, exactly as promised. The full $47,000 had been repaid over the course of 4 months, along with a written apology that I'd read once and then filed away. David had told me about the 401k loan he'd taken, and Janet had sold off what she could. Some things were better left in the past where they belonged. I finished my breakfast and carried my dishes to the sink, rinsing them in water that ran at whatever temperature I chose, taking whatever amount of time felt right to me. These were small freedoms, but they added up to something larger than the sum of their parts. Nothing was fancy, but everything was mine again. 6 months after the doorbell changed everything, I was standing in my kitchen again, but this time I was making Sunday dinner for 3. David sat at my table with his daughter Emma, my granddaughter who was visiting for the weekend. No Janet, just the family that remained, learning how to be together again with honesty instead of silence. Emma was helping me make pie crust, her small hands covered in flour, asking questions about her grandmother's recipes, the way children do when they feel safe enough to be curious. David reached over to refill my water glass without being asked, a small gesture I hadn't seen from him in years. I watched my son teaching his daughter how to set the table properly, the way I'd taught him 35 years ago, and I realized that sometimes the best gift you can give your family is teaching them that love has boundaries. The doorbell rang while we were eating dessert. This time it was just Martha bringing over tea cookies she'd made with too much sugar and not enough sense. We laughed about it over coffee, 3 generations learning that family doesn't have to be perfect to be worth keeping. If you've ever felt like a guest in your own life, remember this. I learned dignity has a key too, and it belongs in your pocket. Nobody can take that from you unless you let them. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing alone for a while, but the right people will still be there when you're ready to let them back in. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have an older neighbor who's gone quiet, knock. Sometimes a knock is how a life comes back.